In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the West once again and see what was occurring while these great battles, such as Gettysburg, for example, were happening over in the East. Now remember, the commanders in the West were primarily Grant and eventually Sherman as well. And they were able, along with other commanders, to take places like Chattanooga with its great Lookout Mountain, and even Sherman himself took Atlanta, the great capital of Georgia, with its great defenses. In fact, it was so well defended, the Confederacy, which lost about 1,000 men defending it, but was still not able to successfully keep it, was still able to cause some 27,000 casualties on the side of the Union. But it's really here that we see a key decision on the side of Sherman and the Union to actually bring total warfare to this conflict. It was here that Sherman decided that he was so far away from supply lines that he would simply have his men live off the land. That meant take whatever you can find, even though it's not yours, and then destroy whatever you cannot consume, because we do not want to actually give any assistance to the Confederacy. We want to bring them to our knees. In fact, all you have to do is read Sherman's own words. He said this: "The government of the United States has any and all rights which they choose to enforce in war, to take their lives, their homes, their lands, their everything. War is simply power, unrestrained by Constitution. To the persistent secessionist, that is a Southerner, why, death is a mercy, and the quicker he or she is disposed of, the better." That was the attitude Sherman took with him as he and his forces carved a 60-mile-wide path of destruction all the way to the sea and the city of Savannah by Christmas, which he said to Lincoln was his Christmas present. The Confederacy, meanwhile, being cut in two, was really not able to do anything directly to stop Sherman. Lee was busy trying to fight against Grant, now in Virginia. Lincoln himself had already said that he would give 3 more years to this conflict if it needed it, even more, perhaps. So it turned really to men in the West, in places like Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee, to see if they could do anything to stop this Union onslaught and somehow still win independence for the Confederacy. The leader of this was, of course, Nathan Bedford Forrest. He wasn't exactly in command of all the forces. In fact, he wouldn't have that role until the very end of the war, but he really is the most influential commander at this time. Forrest was born in Tennessee. He became a planter in Mississippi and eventually moved to Memphis. He himself had lost his father at the age of 16 and had to lead the family from that time on. He engaged in all kinds of businesses, including slave dealing. He was actually engaged in that trade that even Southerners who owned slaves, or those in the North who owned slaves, always saw as a rather diabolical trade, because after all, you were trading people around. In other words, they had that strange view that you should at least keep people in the family. It was still connected to slavery, which of course is peculiar, but that's still how they thought. Even so, we do know that Forrest eventually gave up the slave trade. It's possible he gave it up simply because he wanted something to be more noble. There's also some accounts that this is when he became a Christian, a believer. However, there's probably a more convincing argument to see that he probably became a believer several years after the war. Now, Forrest was a man who was always known for his bravery and really known simply for just having guts. For example, there's one story that when he was in Memphis, there was a young man who had killed another man in the streets and, of course, was taken to jail to be put on trial for murder. Well, a lynch mob came. In fact, some 1,000 people came. They surrounded the jail and preparing to actually take this boy out and just hang him right there on the streets. Forrest, believing this to be an act of injustice, which it was, decided that he would defend the boy. And so he went to the jail, and there in the midst of the mobs, he told them that they would have to kill him in order for them to get to the boy. And because Forrest had such commanding presence, he was actually able to convince the mob to go home, at which point, within a few weeks, they elected him to be on the city council of Memphis. Rather, one of the incredible stories that we have regarding Forrest. Now, Forrest, at the outbreak of the war between the states, would eventually raise his own cavalry unit, and he would arm them famously with 6-shooters and with sawed-off rifles and with razor-sharp sabers. He also was one who loved to use trickery. He would often have his men bring things like kettle drums so they could be very loud when they were surrounding the enemy, say at night, to convince the enemy that they had more men than they actually did. He was a man who hated to be on the defensive. He always said that if you have a chance to charge, you should charge. In fact, famously, when he was attacked from both sides, and his men said, "What can we do? We can't charge there without charging here also." And he famously said, "Well, you charge both ways." He was also famous for saying things like, "The person who wins the battle is the one who gets there first with the most men," which of course is painfully obvious, but it's quite true. And so he really had a strategic mind, kind of like George Washington, in the sense that he understood the best thing to do was to stay alive. The best thing to do was to try and win small-scale battles, try to disrupt the supply lines and the communications of the enemy, and eventually they will be so frustrated that they will actually talk about terms of peace. And so it was at places like Murfreesboro in Tennessee, where Forrest, with some 400 men, attacked a garrison of 1,200. What he did was he snuck in at night, and then he woke up the commander. There were still 1,200 guys the commander could call to. They hadn't all been engaged in fight yet. But he told the commander, he said, "Listen, I have you surrounded with thousands of guys. You need to give up." Now the commander wasn't really sure this was true because he couldn't see the thousands. So Forrest had his men march around the square through the openings of the buildings. And he had it look like there were thousands of guys marching through, but instead, as each of these small divisions would march, they would quickly run around the other side and then get back in line. So the commander of the Union Army thought he was seeing different guys, even though he was probably seeing the same 100 guys over and over and over again. Eventually, he surrendered, later realized that he had surrendered 1,200 to only 400, tried to renege on his surrender, and Forrest said, "Sorry." Forrest, though, was famous for attacking railroads, for attacking the telegraph lines, the supply lines of the Union. As a result, men like Sherman, who was still stationed in places like Tennessee and eventually Georgia, was obsessed with trying to stop Forrest. He called him that devil Forrest. He said he would bankrupt the entire treasury just to stop him. Even after the war, he would call Forrest the most remarkable man to fight on either side. Forrest himself was almost captured on numerous times. Sometimes he would have to use pistols to actually parry the blows of sabers. At one point, when he and his men were surrounded, they had about 2,000, surrounded by a much superior force of a Union army. He began to call out and have his other officers call out orders to pretend soldiers and pretend officers to bring up additional men. They were so convincing at this that the Union Army assumed he had 50,000 strong and began to reinforce their position and even spiked several guns along the Mississippi River, which means they made them inoperable, because they believed the Confederacy under Forrest was leading a full-scale assault. Instead, he was just trying to survive. However, most famously, Forrest would fight the Union at a place called Bryce's Crossroads. And it was there that he was outnumbered 2-1, but he decided to split his forces and attack from 3 sides. And it was there that he decided that he would charge at both flanks and from behind and at the center of the Union lines. He used his entire force. He did not leave any men in reserve, and he even brought his artillery into danger-close position, which meant they would be very deadly against the Union forces, but they would also be very easy to capture. His men so successfully and so quickly brought forth this plan, which surprised the Union forces, that they won this battle, which by all accounts they should not have actually won. Eventually, he was put under the command of General Hood, who had command of the Army of the West for the Confederacy. And Hood, after having the Union Army escape by him in the night, decided that he would attack in a suicide-like charge against the small city of Franklin where the Union was housed. He eventually, even though Forrest told him not to do this, he eventually carried out the battle. It was one of the bloodiest battles in the whole history of the war. And then he decided, after that failure, that he would attack Nashville, another great defensive position for the Union, and try to retake that for the Confederacy. Once again, though, Forrest gave him advice. This time, Forrest asked for all of the cavalry and up to an entire infantry brigade. He actually had a plan to take the Union at Nashville, but he was denied this plan. Eventually, towards the end of the war, Forrest would be put in supreme command over the forces in the West, especially the cavalry, but he never really was allowed to actually show forward his real strategy because he was never given enough authority early enough in the war. We'll take a look at how the war actually ended in the next video.